Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and I'm happy to welcome you here. I know that a great number of people have not recovered sufficiently from late-night parties to be here. I, however, drove a round trip to Richmond, was there for the victory party, drove back, and got here reasonably on time. There will be others who will filter in. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this, our November Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times, and it's interesting to think about the effect of yesterday's elections on the public policy process. I had lunch with Cato Byrne of the National Review Foundation a couple of weeks ago and told her that if the elections went as they have in fact gone, that these elections might prove to be, as I said, portentously a hinge of history. And she made the comment back, hinge of history. Well, just think about the results. At the breakfast table, speaking with our speaker's wife, she mentioned a very obvious thing, which is the reality of the effect this election result will have on candidate recruitment. I think that will be significant, and it might even affect it, and it would affect both the Republican candidate recruitment and the Democrat candidate recruitment. If it looks like a very good Republican year, you'll get better candidates for the Republican Party, and Democrats who are thinking about running some of them will say, hey, this may not be the year for me to run. And we also have the effect on donations to conservative organizations and party committees. There's a potential win psychology. But there's also a substantial effect, I believe, in what's going to happen within the Democratic caucuses in the House and the Senate. President certainly stuck his neck out pretty far in New Jersey, and people are going to consider whether they have to follow what he wants in the Congress. So altogether, it is certainly a very interesting time. This year, the Leadership Institute has already trained 6,058 students. We've held 150 schools of our 41 types of schools, and since 1979, the Institute has trained more than 76,200 people. You have before you our current 2009 school schedule. I urge you to take a moment to review that goldenrod paper. That's what the paper company calls that color. And consider attending one of those schools or sending a friend to one of our programs. Our flagship school, the Youth Leadership School, will be held here in this room in our F.M. Kirby National Training Center on December 5th and 6th. You'll find this information about this school and a nomination form for this school at your table. If you know of anybody who might be interested in attending this school in December, if you would, write their names down and give the nomination form to any of our Leadership Institute staff members. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Christopher Doss, who will offer an invocation and lead us in a Pledge of Allegiance. Chris Doss works here as a grassroots activist schools coordinator. He has been a presenter and adjunct lecturer at approximately 17 college and university campuses, as well as think tanks, public affairs institutions, seminars, and workshops, both in the United States and Europe. Chris has drafted nearly half a dozen laws that have been enacted in Virginia and other states. He did his undergraduate work in political philosophy at Wake Forest University in North Carolina and graduate work in communications at the University of Oslo in Norway, which Helen and I visited in August. Chris, come give us an invocation and lead us in the pledge.
Thank you very much. One must never miss an opportunity, now that history has been thrown out of most of our schools and universities, to teach a history lesson. With that in mind, I hope you'll indulge me. Our invocation this morning is from the Book of Common Prayer, the prayer for our country. Almighty God, who has given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable industry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from violence, discord, and confusion, from pride and arrogance, and from every evil way. Defend our liberties and fashion into one united people the multitudes brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endue with the spirit of wisdom those to whom in thy name we entrust the authority of government, that there may be justice and peace at home, and that through obedience to thy law we may show forth thy praise among the nations of the earth. In times of prosperity, fill our hearts with thankfulness, and in days of trouble, suffer not our trust in thee to fail. All which we ask through thy holy name, O Lord, our Creator, as thou didst lead thy chosen people through the wilderness, so lead us that we may do thy will. Blessed art thou, O Lord God of our fathers, praised and exalted above all forever. Amen. And may I ask you to join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag, and I would ask that you do it in our common language, since we are of many kindred people. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now I will introduce to you Eric Slee, who will give a report briefly on the Leadership Institute's programs. He is currently the Director of Communications Training Department. He was previously a legislative correspondent for Congressman Mark Green of Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District, and there he was responsible for researching and responding to issues and concerns of constituents of the congressman in the 8th District. Prior to working in D.C., Eric served as College Republican Chair on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, as well as the 6th Congressional District Coordinator for the Wisconsin State College Republicans. He got his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh. Eric, come talk to us a bit.
All right, thank you, Morton. If I remember correctly, the last time I stood up here and gave a programs report, it was after the 2008 election. Man, you guys were bummed. So I'm glad to see there's a little bit more optimism in the room than that turnout. Well, it's good to see everyone here this morning, and I'm happy to give you an update on what we are doing in the Communications Training Department. So far this year, my department has trained over 650 conservatives from more than 120 different organizations, 14 Hill offices, and more than 43 universities. By attending a communications training here at the Leadership Institute, conservatives learn how to successfully manage their public image as either a candidate or activist, or the organization that they're currently working for. This is accomplished through some of the most intensive trainings that the Institute has to offer, such as the Advanced Public Relations School or the on-camera television trainings, which I can tell you are uncomfortable sometimes. We really try to put it to these kids and sometimes candidates. In fact, I saw Senator Voinovich, not a favorite I'm sure in the room amongst conservatives, but we had a TV training here last year for him and his staff, and saw some of them out last night, and they thanked me again for the training that they received here at the Leadership Institute. although Senator Voinovich, I believe, announced retirement 3 days after we trained him here in the studio. So I think I did a good job. Well, as the Obama administration continues its war on the media, and more specifically on young conservative journalists who ask tough questions, the Institute remains committed to supporting young conservative journalists. And to this end, we will be conducting a broadcast journalism school this weekend for young conservatives from all around the country. We'll teach them more than just how to read a teleprompter and write for broadcast. We'll also teach them the skills necessary to get a job, land interviews, and also give them, as a resource, the names of some of the 91 graduates of the broadcast journalism school who are currently working in television news, who have offered themselves as mentors. And this time around, planning for the BJS, I can tell you that there were many anchors and reporters who were very anxious to offer their name in support of these young conservative journalists who rightly so are skeptical of those in power and are willing to ask tough questions. As a graduate of the broadcast journalism school, these students will become eligible to receive a $3,000 Balanced Media Fellowship, which will help them fund either low-paying or non-paid internships at television stations of their choice. I just want to share with you before I leave the words of one of our current Balanced Media Fellowship recipients, Josiah Ryan, who is reporting overseas for the Jerusalem Post. He says, "As my work continues, I am grateful to Morton Blackwell and the Leadership Institute and its many strong supporters for choosing me as a partner. The Leadership Institute has armed me with vast amounts of potent technical and ideological conservative training and has placed me in positions where I could fight for those beliefs. Since the Leadership Institute recruited me to come to Washington in the summer of 2007, it has remained my greatest ally as I have fought to be a conservative in the national and international news business." So with that, I'd also like to thank you for your support of the Leadership Institute and for letting us do the work that we do, supporting these young, conservative, ambitious journalists who are fighting to bring balance back to the media. So thank you again.
Thank you, Eric. And now to introduce our distinguished speaker, I'm presenting to you Christopher Malagisi. Chris is Director of Political and Online Training at the Institute. He is responsible for training and organizing our political, online, fundraising, and career trainings. He's trained over 3,000 candidates, activists, and campaign officials. He is a frequent trainer and guest lecturer at numerous conferences and universities across the country and overseas. Chris is the president and principal founder of the Young Conservatives Coalition, an advocacy organization dedicated to organizing the next generation of the conservative movement. Chris was recently awarded the 2009 Rising Star Award from Campaigns and Elections Politics magazine. He received a master's degree in public administration from Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Public Affairs, and he graduated from American University with a bachelor's in political science. Chris, come please and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Morton. I, like Eric last year, was here as well, and I remember after the elections, I went to bed early last year. I think I went to bed around 9 or 10 o'clock. One of those rare times, went to bed early. Last night, though, I was up till about 2:30 in the morning, so therefore coffee wasn't enough for me. I had to do a nitrous Monster energy drink to keep me up this morning. So please bear with me as I do this introduction. It's my proud honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today, and please bear with me with this because it's quite an extensive resume. Since December of 1984, David Keene has been the chairman of the American Conservative Union, the nation's oldest and largest grassroots conservative lobbying organization. He is also a managing associate at the Carmen Group, a lobbying firm that's located in Washington, D.C. Mr. Keene attended the University of Wisconsin Law School, where he was the national chairman of the Young Americans for Freedom there. Mr. Keene also, since then, has been a JFK Fellow with Harvard University's Institute of Politics, a First Amendment Fellow at Vanderbilt University's Freedom Forum, and a member of the Board of Visitors at Duke University's Public Policy School, and is a member and a board member of the National Rifle Association. Mr. Keene has an impressive resume, has been involved in pretty much every single presidential election since Richard Nixon, when he served as a special assistant to Spiro Agnew. He was also the Southern Regional Political Director for Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign in 1976. He was the National Political Director for George Bush's presidential campaign in 1980, and he was Senior Advisor to former Senator Bob Dole in 1988, and an advisor to presidential candidate Bob Dole in 1996. He's recognized as one of the chief spokesmen for conservative principles in politics. Accordingly, he's regularly featured on various publications, radio, television, and has produced literature in the National Review, the Washington Times, the Boston Globe, and presently writes a column for the Hill newspaper, which is a newspaper that covers Congress. On a personal note, I've come to greatly admire and respect David Keene over these past few months, as he has become a great resource, advisor, and mentor, not only for me, but the Leadership Institute. Let me give you an example. As Director of Political Training here at the Institute, our department is responsible for our career schools. And what we've tried to do in this is to help conservatives, young conservatives primarily, try to learn how to get a job in the movement. In particularly, as well as the same time, give a little education about where the conservative movement is today. And every time that we've asked David Keene to come and speak, he's graciously accepted and weaves an intricate yet palpable understanding for our participants about the conservative movement, where we are today, where we've been, and where we're going. Obviously, with his vast experience, he offers much more than just a lecture on conservative prudence. He and his staff at the ACU have also graciously advised me and recognized the importance of the next generation of the conservative movement and the necessity of preparing what some might call the fourth generation of the conservative movement. This is viscerally evidenced by CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, the annual gathering of movement conservatives from around the country that's held each year. I like to think that there are two introductory gateways into the conservative movement. You have the Leadership Institute, and particularly the Youth Leadership School, which myself I attended, and CPAC. It was at CPAC that I and other young professional conservatives first got a glimpse into the intricacies and intrigues that inspired us to become movement conservatives through their panels and speeches and lectures and all the different organizational booths and fairs that they have there, and the recognition of conservative grassroots activists, such as the Ronald Reagan Award, an award given not necessarily to those with household name recognition, but the men and women working in the trenches who sacrifice and in doing so set an example for others. David Keene and the ACU place a high emphasis on young conservative activism, something that the Leadership Institute strongly encourages, and is recognized in their admirable and successful efforts to recruit students for CPAC each year. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but as a guest speaker at the last ACU board meeting, I overheard somebody saying that at last year's CPAC, nearly 50% of all the participants were students, over 4,000 of them. And I think they had 8,500, 9,000 attendees that attended there last year, which is very impressive. It is leaders like David Keene and other organizations like the ACU which allow our movement to thrive and lessons of each generation be passed down to the next. Well, I know this is somewhat a serious yet over resume about a lot of good things that David Keene has done. I had to ask him this morning, give me something that's different, unique, and some fun things. And he says he loves to fly fish and do woodworking. He may have a story surrounding that for you. But it is my humble honor and privilege to introduce our guest speaker today, David Keene.
Thank you, Chris. I don't know if what sort of a tribute it is to be introduced by somebody who had to get a caffeine jolt before he was able to bring himself to actually do the introduction. But Chris does great work, and I'd like to take a minute or so just before I get into what are not really formal but informal remarks. First, it's always good to hear somebody, a fellow cheesehead, give a report on political activity, and one of the great attributes of the Leadership Institute is that it recruits people from all over the country. You know, Morton and I have been friends for, what, 40 years. Sometimes when I hear one of these introductions, I'm reminded of some years ago at an anniversary dinner for the New York Conservative Party, my old boss and good friend Jim Buckley, who was still at that point not fully retired from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, had to ask permission of the Ethics Committee to come to the dinner because it was a political dinner. He said, "I'm not going as a speaker, I'm going as an artifact." And that carried the day, and they allowed him to attend, and sometimes we feel like artifacts. You know, but it's interesting because when you come to Washington, as many young people do, they come ready to change the world. We were ready to change the world in 1969, 1970. And then after you've been here for a while, you find out that the world is fairly resistant to change, and you ought to be able to do what you can. And eventually, you decide that, you know, if after you're done, you've done some good things and you can leave with more people like you in place than there were when you got there, you've accomplished more than you could have asked to accomplish. I've maybe been able to bring 2 or 3 people in. Morton's brought in, what did you say, 69,000 or something. So I think that when we calculate the impact of people of my generation that came in with the conservative movement, that Morton Blackwell stands at the top. When I talk to young people who come to the Leadership Institute, as Chris mentioned, I talk about the movement as it was in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and tell them, you know, and we don't have to feel this way today, but maybe after your thing last year, you shouldn't be despondent because you're looking at a glass and saying it's half empty, when in fact it's much fuller than it was when we came along. Because of the infrastructure that's been built, because of the base of people, because of the thousands of people that have been trained by Morton and trained by others. In the early days of the movement, we didn't have all this institutional framework. We didn't have the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute. We didn't have the Leadership Institute. We didn't have any of these things. And so we are in a position today where, based on our ideals and principles, we can do and accomplish much more than we ever could have believed possible 20, 30, or 40 years ago. And that, I think, is incredibly important for us to remember all the time. I decided as I was preparing to come here today that since we were meeting right after the election, if anyone actually showed up after having worked all day yesterday and fortunately partied all last night, that we ought to talk a little bit about where we are politically. Because ultimately it's where we are politically that enables us to accomplish the policy goals that bring us into this movement and into politics in the first place. And we are in much better shape, of course, than we were a year ago when you had to stand in front of this microphone. A year ago, remember, a year ago we were told that the world had changed, as indeed it turned out it had, but that it had changed in a way that would make it impossible for conservatives to come back. It had changed so that once again, and this was perhaps the 3rd time in the years in which I've been involved in politics, people were predicting the demise of the Republican Party. And believe me, the Republican Party over those decades has done enough to have its demise predicted. But each time that prediction is made, it turns out that it was premature. Because the Republican Party, for all its faults, is the vehicle through which conservatives achieve their political goals. And because this country, contrary to the conclusions of those who analyzed the entrails of the 2006 and 2008 election, this country has not changed in its values or its beliefs. Contrary to all of that, the Republican Party has once again come back. Now, I do take some exception, and I did publicly the other day when the current chairman of the Republican National Committee said that this election would be a referendum on him and the party. I reviewed the exit polls, and I couldn't find anybody who came out of those polls saying that they voted as they did because of Michael Steele, or they voted as they did because of the great brand of the Republican Party. What they did do is they reacted to something that voters often react to, and that is the fact that elected politicians, when they win, tend to believe that the public supports everything that they in their hearts want done. And that's what Barack Obama did. He didn't wake up the day after the 2008 election and say, you know, I'm going to be president because they didn't like George Bush, or I'm going to be president because the Republicans screwed up in terms of their performance. He woke up. He may have said those things during the campaign, but he woke up the next morning and he said, I'm going to be president because they love me. And they want to do everything I want to do. That's what I meant when I talked about change. And then, like other winning politicians of both parties, he went out and decided to do it and found out, gee, that really wasn't why they elected him. And that his definition of change might not have been their definition of change. The result of that is that successful politicians sow the seeds sometimes of their own defeat and sometimes of at least being brought back to earth. And that's what Barack Obama and those who came to Washington with him have done. Now, politicians and parties spin election results to their own benefit. I noticed that this morning David Axelrod said the only election that was important was the one that took place in the New York 23rd District. The other ones were just you know, individual defeats because we nominated bumblers and incompetents. So when you have a losing, if you're president or part of a president's administration and one of your people lose, it was because the guy was either an incompetent, an idiot, or some other circumstance defeated him. It certainly wasn't your fault. And certainly the policies and the favorability of your candidate had nothing to do with anything else. And that's always partially right. But the fact of the matter is that the Republican resurgence that we witnessed yesterday at the polls was in large measure a result of the overreach of an administration and a party that the public is now fearful of because it's in fact in control of the country. It's interesting because in state legislative races in places, people leaving the polls were asked why they voted for Republican state legislative candidates, and some of them told reporters because we're afraid of what's going on in Washington and we need to send a message. This election was a message. The question is whether this administration will listen to that message or whether it's too late. The question is whether, as the Washington Post describes it, was a warning to the president, or whether it's the kind of wave that a previous president faced when the out party, the Republican Party, swept these races in 1993. And in many ways, the situation that we find ourselves in today, while from a policy standpoint maybe even more ominous than that we faced in 1993, the situation is nevertheless similar. And what we have now is an expansion of concern among previously uninvolved members of the public about where this government is going. And so we had this year, as we had in the early 90s, more and more people getting involved for the first time. And it's amazing because that gives Morton more people to train because we're going to have more elections. It's interesting. I'm going to talk about that race in New York in a little bit because I think it's not the only important race, but it was a very important race for reasons that David Axelrod doesn't find himself capable of grasping. But even there, you go up there, and I said to Morton, as we were sitting here having coffee before I got up, and that I'd done a conversation, a blog meeting, conference call with the bloggers yesterday with Hoffman's manager, and Morton said, oh yeah, well, he's a graduate of the Leadership Institute. You know, it's really frustrating. You can't go anywhere and find someone that isn't. And that's healthy, but Morton's going to have a whole new group of people to train because there are so many new people getting involved in politics because of what's happening here in Washington and out in the country, but primarily here in Washington. That's the backdrop, that's the context in which these contests were run. And the White House can deny it, but the president doubled down on some of these elections. He went to New Jersey 5 times. 5 times. I don't know of a Republican president who did that in an off-year election. It's in some ways a tribute to Barack Obama that he was willing to invest that much of his own capital into a loser like John Corsi. But the fact of the matter is that he did it and can't afterwards claim that he didn't have anything to do with the defeat or that it had no reflection on him, particularly in a state that he'd carried overwhelmingly and which any analyst would have told you was a Democratic state, and in which we now have the thing that it was reported last night that John Corzine in his 3 races has managed to spend $125 million of his own dollars, which is in itself good to deprive him of some of his net worth. I don't know how many of you remember the years ago when Arch Moore, I'm sure Morton does, in West Virginia, ran against Jay Rockefeller, and bumper strips appeared that said, "Make him spend it all," which I always thought was one of the great bumper strips in political history. There is a feeling right now, like 1993, against political establishments. You saw that in many races yesterday. And like 1993, and this is where the Republicans and where we have to be a little bit careful because it hasn't gelled completely into something that we can count on in 2010. If you remember back to 1993, and there at least half of us here are old enough to do that, this same atmosphere existed, and it wasn't until the late summer of '94 that it became a partisan outrage, that it was directed primarily at the Democrats, which was one of the reasons there were such surprises in the '94 election, because it had been an anti-Washington feeling, and it had then morphed into an anti-democratic feeling and a reaction against the Democrats. One of the reasons it did that was because the Republicans had a consistent message in 1993 and 1994 that drew a line in the sand with the Democrats on one side, the Republicans on the other side, and the public made a choice and crossed that line. And as a result of that, we took over the Congress for the first time in 40 years. We had some advantages then because our people hadn't been in power, and therefore the voters didn't know how feckless they could really be. But it was the consistency of that message that was so important to the victories that took place in 1994. The same thing is happening this year. We have public outrage at many of the things, most of the things, in fact, that the Obama administration is trying to accomplish. But we also, if we look at the polls, find that, just as an example, that the label conservative is very popular. The label Republican is less popular than it's been in a decade, because the destruction of the Republican brand that took place over the course of the last 8 or 9 years has not yet been repaired. And that's one of the reasons that I took exception to the Republican National Chairman saying it was the Republican brand that's attracted these voters. It isn't. It's a rejection of what the political establishment seems to want for this country. And we need to recognize that as we go forward. I think the people in this room are more likely to recognize and appreciate that than your average Washingtonian, because the people in this room got involved in politics to the extent they are on the basis of ideas and principles. That's what it's all about. It's not about jobs. It's not about all of the perks that come with being an elected official or being somebody who works in the White House or works on the Hill or knows this person or that person. It's because of what we want and what we believe in. And that's what's going on in the country today. And unless Republicans recognize that, we're going to have a problem. I think that the hardest thing that the Democrats have to deal with today is Virginia, because of the turnaround that took place in the Commonwealth last night. You know, if you go back, and Morton, as the national committeeman from Virginia, can attest to this, one of the reasons that Governor Keene is chairman of the Democratic National Committee is that in the Democratic narrative about the changing America in which we live, Virginia has been Exhibit 1. It's the state that was moving from red to purple to blue. This was the election where that state was going to be sewed up for a decade. This was the election a year ago in which we were told that the Democrats now had converted Virginia. They would take the House of Delegates this year. They would elect the Democratic governor. It would be over. Now we're told by these same people. And this was a narrative that was not only bought but trumpeted in the mainstream media. That this is the state to look at. And having created that narrative, it's a little difficult now to say that it was all true except this fella Deeds, you know, just couldn't pull it off. That is not sufficient. Not when Republicans swept all the constitutional offices and increased their support in the legislature as much as they did last night, and by the margins that took place last night. So that's a very difficult, it seems to me, story for Democrats to spin, and one can understand why David Axelrod said, don't look at Virginia, and certainly don't look at New Jersey. Why don't you look at the 23rd District of New York up in the Adirondacks? That's the important race that took place. And I'd like to talk about that race for a minute, because there are two battles that are currently going on related to what I've been talking about. The first one, obviously, is the battle between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, in a partisan sense, for the future of this country. The second one is a battle for the soul of the Republican Party, and to see whether the Republican Party actually will be able, in the years ahead, to project the kind of consistent message that led to the victories that we had in 1994, and which allows people to see that there is a line in the sand and a difference between the two parties. And that battle was being fought in New York, in the Adirondacks, where no one a year or 6 months ago would have suggested that any important battles might take place. And in fact, when John McHugh, the Republican congressman who resigned that seat to take a position in the Obama administration, when he first resigned, we put together a conference call with bloggers, and Lisa DePasquale, who many of you know, who runs CPAC for us and who was putting that together because she's ACU's blogger person as well, was trying to get people on the call, and she said, several of them said, why would I be interested? I'm not interested, you know, this is not interesting to me. We don't care about some obscure race in New York. And we were arguing this is not an obscure race, this is important. Because what happened up there, and you have to understand New York law a little bit, if there's a special election, there's no convention, there's no primary, there's nothing of that sort. The county chairmen in the district get together and decide who the candidate's going to be. They interview people. In this instance, a former congressman's chief of staff who currently works for the NRCC sat in these closed meetings with the county chairman after having taken care of things beforehand. There were 8 potential candidates who interviewed to be the nominee. The Conservative Party of New York, which is important in New York because of the fact that it's the only state that allows cumulative votings where you have cross endorsements, had indicated beforehand that of the 8 candidates, they would endorse 7 of them if they were the nominee. And that because those 7 were conservative, but that the 8th one was not, because the 8th potential candidate was the 3rd most liberal member of the New York State Legislature. Not the 3rd most liberal Republican, the 3rd most liberal member of the legislature. And a candidate who had run, who'd run with SIEU support, who had endorsed ACORN, a candidate who had run with the endorsement of a party sponsored and wholly owned by ACORN, a candidate who was against every single thing that Republicans in the district favored. They came out of that meeting and said, this was the candidate that we need. This is the candidate that we want. As the Weekly Standard reported, this Republican candidate was probably the single most liberal House candidate nominated by the Republican Party anytime, anywhere. And the result of that was a break in the party in New York. The conservatives said, we're not going to go with that, recruited one of the other 8 candidates to run against the Republican. And once that happened, the Republican candidate's support began to collapse. It was interesting because she, the Republican candidate, a woman by the name of Didi Skazafava, had been interviewed by the Democrats. And even though she was a, quote, Republican assemblywoman, had been asked to run for this seat by the Democratic Party and said, no, it was a Republican district. She thought she'd keep that label. The conservatives had predicted at that time that if she was elected, she would not only vote with the Democrats in Washington, but within 2 years when she ran for re-election, or within a year, she would run as a Democrat. And of course, the Washington establishment said, no, she's a centrist. She's a moderate. She's just the kind of candidate we need in that district or in any other district, and she would never be a Democrat. When her support collapsed, she announced first that, well, the first thing that happened that resulted in this was that George Pataki, an establishment former governor, moderate Republican, announced that he was supporting the conservative, which was a signal that the New York Republicans had thrown in the towel on this deal. She then held a press conference at which she announced that she was suspending her candidacy, but as a loyal Republican, she would never switch parties or endorse the Democrat. 36 hours later, robocalls began going out to Republicans in the district saying that we had to do something because the lunatics were taking over the party, and the only responsible person in the district was the Democrat. That was after meetings with senior Democratic congressmen from Washington who went up there, after Rahm Emanuel's involvement, and after the Democratic leadership of New York, including the man they hoped to be governor, had meetings with the candidates. So I'm sure that her employment will be taken care of in the future. But the fact of the matter is, and I had a call with a number of people from up there yesterday, I had said we got into this race, and ACU was very involved in it, as were a lot of people. We got into this race for several reasons, one of which was that it happens every decade or so that a strong message has to be sent to the Washington Republican establishment, that while we do not demand as conservatives ideological conformity, because indeed not every candidate in every district can agree with us on everything. I think Chris was here, I was at one of your job things, and I said, I've still been looking for the person who agrees with me on everything. And afterwards, one of his people came up and said, I don't know what you believe in, but if I could get a job, I would agree with you. Well, we don't demand that of our candidates, but there is a step too far, which is what the Republicans did in New York this time. And when that happens, and when the Republican establishment in Washington then takes $1 million that they've raised from conservative contributors and puts it into that race to demonize the conservative candidate, which is where the first 3/4 of that money went, we have a right to object, and I think we should object, and I think we did. And I told these people, as we got into this race because we wanted to send a message to the Republican establishment. And I said, I don't care how the vote comes out tonight. I do, because I'd like to have seen Doug Hoffman come to Washington. But we've won that fight. We've sent that message, because people are now going to have to be cognizant of the fact that they can't look at candidates in the way they have in the past. These things happen for a very simple reason, because the so-called professional consultants in Washington are very much like the economists who involve themselves in static economic analysis, who will say when you know, the tax cuts don't have impact anywhere else, it's just the revenue loss from the cut. They look at it and they say, you know what we need to do is we need to find somebody that's just a little left of center, because that way we can count on all of our people to go along like sheep, and then we can steal a few of their people, and that way we'll win an election. Now that works as long as all the members of your party are related to sheep. But every once in a while, the sheep get restless, and they don't have enough dogs to keep the sheep together. And once they learn this, that has impact. I think people are going to be cautious in this candidate recruitment. They're not going to automatically go with that kind of analysis. That's the kind of analysis that led to what I think will be the second most important race for conservatives of this cycle, which is the primary election that's coming up next year in Florida, where we have been told, and I don't know how many of you have ever met or heard or know anything about Marco Rubio, who was the Speaker of the lower house in Florida, who's young, who's articulate, who's conservative, who's Hispanic, and who was term limited. it's interesting because, and who is a true hero within the party in that state. The Republican Senatorial Committee, under the leadership of John Cornyn of Texas, decided that they could save money because the governor of Texas, or of Florida, wanted to be a senator, and he had money in his account. So they could save $7 million if they got him to run for the Senate. And he said, that's fine, but I want your endorsement early in case there's a primary with this guy Rubio. So they said, fine, for $7 million, you got it. And then Marco Rubio decided to run. And it's a long way off, but he's raising money now very effectively. And the county committees around the state have been meeting. And this is an incumbent governor he's running against. And he's typically been winning the votes at those county committees by 85%. It's a case in which the Republican establishment, which is smarter than anybody else, decided that they knew better than the people of a state who their candidate ought to be and decided to pick him. I reminded a senator who was talking about this with me that in 1981, after the 1980 election, there were 5 sitting freshman Republican senators who had been officially opposed in their primary elections by the Republican Senatorial Committee because they could not win. And I said, those guys came to town with an attitude. And after that, people were a little more cautious. Well, after the New York 23rd, and after the primary that's going to take place in Florida, the Republican establishment is going to be a little more cognizant of the needs and the desires of the people that it supposedly represents. And that, if it happens, and I think it will, that is going to have tremendous impact on the political future of this country, because it will allow us to achieve many of the things that we want to achieve. I could go on, and I often do, but I'm not going to do that. Am I supposed to take questions, Morton? I would hope so.
Thank you. Question?
We have question mics also.
Oh, sorry. I interfered with the natural order of things there.
Franklin, who did you call on, David? I think me. All right.
But he's not sure.
Thank you for coming this morning. Is it on now? Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir, for coming. My question is really our communications with, either word of mouth or through the media to, our friends and neighbors and associates who are not conservatives, but who basically open, maybe non-political, but who we deal with all the time. We know who these people are. And I get in this discussion frequently where people say, oh, you're a conservative. Yeah, I am. Well, then, talk a little bit about it. I end up with a phrase that I really like from, I'm not sure if it's Mark Levin or Rush Limbaugh, that basically says that the conservative principles are the best principles that describe the human condition. Just kind of end of statement. But my question to you, sir, is how do we, that message or other message, what's the best way to communicate a thought to somebody who's just, maybe it's a 30-second discussion, so you don't have a long time for a speech, but just to convey our principles to them that they can, grab a hold of?
Well, you don't really need it. When they hear what conservatives actually stand for, and if you look at the polls, they do agree with us. So it's a question of just getting it out there. And you can do that quickly, you can do that symbolically, or you can do that in detail. But I have no fear. Interestingly, you remember CPAC last year when Rush Limbaugh spoke, and it was carried live on television on Fox. MSNBC carried it live. Fox repeated it several times. And it was interesting because I was the next week at a gathering of D.C. business types. And one of them said, it was interesting because we were at our house and we turned this on, and nobody there had ever heard Rush Limbaugh. They said he was a conservative nut, and they wouldn't listen to him. He said, somebody turned on the TV, and we were all sitting there, and they said, and finally one of the guys said, that's what I believe. See, the fact is, just as an example, what happened in New York, was that Republican and conservative enablers allowed the Democrats and the liberals to convince enough people that the conservative candidate was a nut. He was, after all, called a nut by Newt Gingrich, David Brooks, and a number of other people, and was attacked as being crazy by the Republican National Committee, that made a difference. The people that heard the message and got it allowed him to almost win on the third line. But I have no problem. I think what you have to do, and you see that now in the whole Tea Party thing, the town halls, all of this, the more you talk about what you believe in, the more people you're going to get. I mean, you know, if I were a liberal, I'd have to sit around thinking about how I'm going to sell this load to people out there. We don't really have to do that, because the fact of the matter is that people out there agree with us. They're like the people that were watching Limbaugh. They're saying, gee, I thought he was crazy, but I'd never heard him before. If they hear you, you're going to get more than you lose. Do I get to pick?
Sure.
I'm passing Wes over for the lady.
Good morning, thank you. On the way in this morning, I heard a clip of Tom Davis saying that the Republicans needed to find a way to incorporate the Tea Party folks, the grassroots, or we would end up with a third party if the Republicans did not do that. Any comment on that?
Well, Tom is retired. Tom's idea of what we should do is beat the Tea Party people into line so they'll support the kinds of candidates that he might like. That isn't going to happen. I don't think we're going to have a third-party movement. That's not what this is about. What this is about is a recognition of the fact that the Republican Party is the vehicle through which conservatives achieve their policy goals. And therefore, the Republican Party and its adherence to principle is important. Tom is right in one sense, and as I said before, I haven't met a conservative who thinks that there's an ideological mold and a whole set of things that every candidate in every district has to agree with. That's not what it's about. Achieving a majority does require a coalition, and it requires you to recognize that not everybody agrees with you. But you have, if it's a party that has a consistent message, there are some things that are matters of real principle. And it is not irrational, nor is it wrong, to insist that the people that run under your label and take your money and ask you to knock on doors for them agree with you on something. And we had, in the course of the last month or so, Republicans saying that's not important. Newt Gingrich said the only thing that was important was winning, and that if a candidate doesn't agree with you, that's life. No, it isn't life. That's selling out. Yes, we need to incorporate those people, but we're not going to beat them into line. They're not going to come to Republicans because somehow Republicans are superior to everybody else. They're going to come to support candidates who articulate their concerns and their values. And what Republicans have to do is look to their concerns, look to their values, and look to what's happening in the country and respond to those values, those needs, and those concerns, and they'll get them. But these people are not people that are bound to party. Many of them, you go through, you just look at the newspapers today, the interviews of people involved in some of these campaigns. They are people who were not involved before. I saw one of the papers yesterday. This was just before the New York 23rd race, and I clipped it because I was proud of it. They said up there many of these people were neophytes, and then this woman who was on her town board said, I wasn't involved in politics a year ago, but I went to CPAC, and I got turned on, and I came back and ran for the town board and won. Those are the people we need, the new people. And we'll get them if we identify with them. We won't get them if we tell them they have some obligation to support our people, because in a free country, people, and particularly voters, don't have an obligation to support anybody.
I'm a retired police detective from Fort Worth. You know, all of us in this room hate government waste, programs that don't work. In the last 40 years, my profession has spent a trillion tax dollars on our failed war on drugs, modern prohibition. Do you believe, as we have these economic times and going forward, it still doesn't look too good, we can waste another $1 trillion on a program where after 40 years drugs are cheaper, stronger, and easier for our kids to buy?
Well, obviously that's not all working, and we also have managed to make one of the largest expenditures that the states have, the building of prisons, because we have more people in this country in prison as a percentage of our population than any country in the world, probably any country in modern history. So we've got, I mean, it's interesting because I'm one who believes, Richard Viguerie, who many of you know, and myself, and Pat Nolan and others are involved in a conservative criminal justice reform group, because we have for too long just sort of looked at it and said the answer is locking people up for everything. That is not the interesting thing is one of the reasons California is on the way to bankruptcy is that the second strongest union in the state is the prison guards union. They don't really care why you lock people up, but they see them as the more prisoners you have, the more jobs they have. So California just wants to lock you up for everything. It's come down to, it doesn't matter. Has nothing to do with safety. It has nothing to do with better communities. It has everything to do with providing more people for prison guards to guard so they can have more jobs and make more money. I think that's a heck of a way to run a criminal justice system, but that's just me. Wes, I promised.
Dave, Nancy Pelosi has said she's willing to give up some House seats next year if she can get the health care bill through. She's apparently looking at the long haul and sees the fortunes of the party being benefited by more government clampdowns and a new entitlement. That raises the question. There are three things that are happening very shortly. You're going to find out one way or the other what happens. There's the health care, there's the cap and trade, and there's the UN Climate Change Treaty, which is going to be kicked around in Copenhagen next month. If one or all of these measures takes effect the way their backers intend them to be, even if conservatives do have a blowout next year, will it be, quote, too late, unquote, as far as the long haul is concerned?
Well, that's partly, I mean, that's why Paul Ryan, for example, says that we're reaching a tipping point where you can no longer argue about whether you ought to live in a socialist country. You can only argue about how to run it. But we haven't reached that point, as Paul points out, yet, but we could get there. I noticed that yesterday Harry Reid said, well, we're not going to be able to vote on health care this year. We're going to have to move it off to next year. You know, this bunch of folks, whether they're Republicans or Democrats who are in Congress and in the Senate, have one overriding interest. We wouldn't call it a principled interest, but it's staying in their jobs. And they are nervous right now, very nervous. Now, Nancy, her position is perfectly logical. If you're the Speaker of the House and you have party discipline, and you've got 20 or 30 people in your caucus that are a pain because you have to satisfy them, you'd be better off getting rid of them. She would like those blue dogs to disappear. She'd be much happier with a smaller majority that was consistently behind her and liberal and not have to worry about things. The problem with that is that when you decide you'll throw 10 or 15 of them under the bus could careen out of control and hit a lot of others. And that's a hard kind of thing to micromanage. You're playing with losing everything. But I have no doubt that she and the left wing of her party, remember how we felt, because she's in the situation in a different way than Gingrich was in when he was Speaker, when he had to go to Nancy Johnson of Connecticut to ask permission to do anything, because the swing power was really with the moderates and not with the conservatives. She's got a problem, similarly, within her own caucus, and she'd like to get rid of that problem. She'd like to have a consistently liberal caucus, even if it was smaller, as long as it was a majority. Problem is, when you try to get it, it might be smaller, but it might not be a majority.
But will it be too late?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that if we continue what we're doing, if the administration continues to ignore the messages from the public that they're not going to get these things, It's going to be that simple. That's the way this country works.
Want to take one more?
Okay.
My concern is we're funding through tax dollars our own opposition through organizations like ACORN or the Workers' Family Union. We're at a point where we are funding the destruction of our country. Is there any possibility on a local, state, and federal level to cut off things like affordable housing as the housing market collapses, or cutting off these advocacy groups?
You just have to keep working at it. I mean, it's we rail on about these things, and then we go away. I mean, interestingly, from Wes's question, one of the points the Democrats are making internally is that the conservatives and Republicans are getting tired of the health care fight. Maybe they'll go on to something else, and then we can pass it. You know, we're tired of fighting about ACORN. We'll move on to something else, then we can keep funding them. We can't afford to get tired, and you know, he can give you a drink of something if you get tired, boost you right back up, and we can get in there and fight. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Dave. I really appreciate your coming. As a matter of fact, we've been friends and acquainted for more than 40 years, because there was a time when he was chairman of the National Young Americans for Freedom, and I was a member of a YAF chapter at Louisiana State University, and we had certain problems there, and we called him up, and he gave us some assistance, but he wouldn't remember that because he was national chairman, and I was a guy in Baton Rouge, needed some help. But as a token of appreciation, we've got something here for you, and it can be very powerful because last week there arrived all across Northern Virginia a great big postcard that had a picture of Bob McDonnell and Congressman Frank Wolf, the only Republican congressman from Northern Virginia. And there, big as life, with his coat wide open, you could see his entire necktie, which was an Adam Smith tie. And so obviously that is why he got 51% of the vote in Fairfax County, because everybody saw that. So as a token of appreciation, here's a copy. Here's our newest Adam Smith tie model.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you. New one. And anybody here who is interested in buying any of our outstanding Adam Smith ties, you know, there'll be another governor's race in 4 years. It may do you some good. Please contact my assistant, Kathy Graham. She's up, her office is up on the 5th floor, and you can get ties or ladies' scarves or cufflinks or whatever. I invite everybody to join us on Wednesday, December 2nd, 2009, and our Wake Up Club breakfast speaker is who? Do we know?
I think they're out talking to David.
Oh, all right. Well, in any case, we got another great speaker next month. Thank you all for coming.